All right, we're ready for chapters 3 and 4 of the book of Esther. Last week, as I was not here, Dathan taught and introduced the book and covered chapters 1 and 2. I don't know what all was said by way of introduction, so I won't go back through that, but if you were not here and didn't catch this, or maybe it wasn't even discussed, I do want to mention this. So if you've heard this before, act like you're surprised, act like you just learned something. That'll make me feel better. Okay? So here we go. Turn over to the book of Ezra, chapter 6. And at the end of chapter 6, you probably have this note that we went through. If you don't, this would be a good time to make this note. Between those two chapters is where the book of Esther fits. Now, that may have been covered in your introduction last week. We've covered that in years past. We've covered it when we came through the book of Ezra. Micah was teaching that. I think he noted that, but if he didn't, he should have. So anyway, there's a gap of 57 to 58 years between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. And this is where the book of Esther fits. Okay? Makes sense? We're trying to put some chronology to this. The Bible is not presented in true chronology in the sense that you read one book and the next one follows in sequence. So for what that's worth, and then you might make that same note over at the book of Esther, chapter 1, that this fits between Ezra chapter 6 and 7. Now, we're not going to go back through other introductory material, but I do want you to know that information. All right, let's get underway and review where we've been on chapters 1 and 2. You may have a different title. I'm not sure what Dathan called it last week. But chapter 1 of the book of Esther was about what? Something happens. It's a major event. Yeah. All right. Yeah, this is the deposing of that Vashti, the queen. And so she's going out. We'll say more about that in a moment. Chapter 2 was about what? Esther becomes queen. So the king deposes Vashti and Esther is chosen as queen. This is our outline, or one of the outlines that I follow. I'm not sure what was presented last week. I like, you hear me quote Wiersbe. Wiersbe's not a New Testament Christian, but he's one of the best organized men I've ever read after. And I like his outlines. Wiersbe outlines Esther as this: the selection of Esther, chapters 1 and 2, and then we have the detection of Haman, chapters 3 to 7, and then the protection of Israel, 8 through 10. Logical flow. And so we have the king loses Vashti, the king chooses Esther in chapters 1 and 2. Now we're ready for chapters 3 and 4. We have Haman's evil plot and Mordecai's great concern. And then we'll follow that with 5 to 7 next time, or part of that. We won't get all of 7, but Esther's courageous intercession, which is what is being discussed in chapter 4, by the way. So anyway, for what that's worth, that's where we're going. That's where we've been. And I quote Baxter a good bit. Baxter is also a good outliner, but he went at it a little bit different. The crisis anticipated and the crisis overruled. And I like that one as well. Let's go to chapters 3 and 4 now. Chapters 3 and 4 deal with Haman's plot and Haman's plot being told to Esther. But let's go to our questions. Give me a second, let me find mine, and let's go to question number 1. Give me a summary of chapter 3. All right, yes, Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. Haman was promoted by the king. We'll say more about that. And the people try to bow before, or do bow before him. And then we see Mordecai refuses to do that. We'll see more about the details of that here in a second. Let's get question number 2, a short summary of chapter 4. All right, very good. Very good. Let's get question number 3 and then we'll move on. What was Haman's plot? To destroy all the Jews. His anger was so enraged over Mordecai, he's going to seek to destroy all the Jews. Let's mark some Providence passages before we get into chapter 3. I like Matthew Henry's quote about the book of Esther. He said, if the name of God is not here, his finger is. This is a unique book because there's several things that are not mentioned in the book by name. Implied, but God is not mentioned here in the book. His name is not mentioned. Never do you read in the book of Esther, God said, or God told, or referred to at all. That's interesting. That's a unique book. And prayer is not mentioned by name. It's implied. The temple is not mentioned. That's interesting. And nor is praise within itself mentioned. Now there is a celebration toward the end of the book, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So that's why he said, if the name of God is not here, his finger is. What does that mean? Absolutely. We have a view that Mordecai and Esther did not have, don't we? Since you're shaking your head in agreement, explain that. Larry?
Well, obviously, in the whole plot of understanding Esther becoming the queen and the natural part of keeping things closed, you kind of see how that allowed her to work into becoming one of the queens or one of the, I don't know how you call that. Now that allowed her access to that. Or kind of later on being able, like tonight, being able to reach, not able to get to the door. Esther is able to see he's distressed, and that had to be able to be seen. And then the ability to send someone to him, again, her being given the power in order to do that. All those things had to be able to work with them to communicate back and forth and have access to the king.
Absolutely. Very good. What we see here, it's like the book of Job. Job has a limited view of himself and what's going on. We have a better picture because we see the bigger and broader picture of the discussion that God has with Satan. We're seeing the over picture view because we already know how this turns out, don't we? And it's interesting that as the Jews are in Persia and there is this threat that we know how that all turns out, but if they are completely and utterly destroyed, then there goes the Jewish nation through whom the Messiah is going to come. So we've got a bigger picture than Mordecai and Esther have, and so that's what I want us to focus on just for a moment. So we're going to do this, and we're going to add to this through tonight, go through chapter 3 and 4, and then next week we're going to add to this. What I've done in my Bible is take and put a big red circle out beside the passages, or red dot beside the all of the passages we're talking about, and make a little note to the side, and then I make a key somewhere that these are Providence passages in this book. So let's get caught up on those. Let's go to chapter 1. Since you already know all about chapter 1, let's go to chapter 1 and verse 20. And I just put a note out to the side. Vashti being dismissed or deposed is seemingly a matter of providence. Now, if we were living at the time and we heard the king has gotten rid of the queen, it doesn't tell us a whole lot. Because we don't know, at that point, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We already know, though, because we got the bird's eye picture. We know that Esther's going to come to the throne. So if she's not taken off the throne as queen, there's no room for Esther to come in, is there? That seems to be a matter of providence. Did God cause that? I don't know. At least God allowed that, but God's going to use that to his purpose and to his advantage. Let's go to chapter 2 and verse 17. Make a note to the side of that verse. We have Esther becomes queen. Now, had Esther not become queen, she would not have been in a position to go before the king and talk to him, and as we see in tonight's chapter. So that seems to be a matter of providence. And so we're beginning to put 2 and 2 together, and we may be making 6, but that seems like something's going on here, doesn't it? And even Mordecai kind of wondered about that. We're going to see that here in a second and a little bit later. Let's go to chapter 2 and verse 20. Mordecai gains favor of the king in that he found out of the plot to assassinate the king, revealed that, and I put out to the side the question mark of reward. That is that something then the king's going to remember, and perhaps at this juncture, we don't know. That is, if we've only read through chapter 2, we don't know. But you see my point? That may put him in a position to, when there's something needed of Mordecai and Mordecai's family, Mordecai's people, then there may be a reward. We'll come back and finish that list later. So hopefully you've got those three passages marked, 120, 217, and 220. Make sense? All right, let's go to chapter 3. Call this simply Haman's plot to kill the Jews. And so here we have four things that happen, so let's work through this. We have Haman promoted, verses 1 and 2a. Now, from chapter 2 and in verse 16, there is a date given, which would be about 479 BC. And now we have another date given later in verse 7, which indicates that by the time we get to chapter 3, between chapter 2 and 16 and chapter 3 and verse 1, we've had about 5 years to pass. Make sense? So that puts us at about 474 BC, if you want to kind of keep up with the date. Because we're going to have almost a year, 11 months. It's going to be a significant number here in a moment. We'll come to that a little bit later. All right. The king Ahasuerus promoted Haman and advanced him. Why did he advance him? Are we told? Not really told, are we? It may be that he saw leadership in him. The character we see revealed later suggests he's an aggressive man. Perhaps that caught the eye of the king. I don't know. That's just some conjecture that some have made with reference to him. What did he see in him? He saw something that he thought he ought to promote him. Maybe his wealth, if he has that much wealth, I'm wondering where he's getting this wealth from. And we'll talk about that. It very well may be that he's going to get that from the Jews. And so that may be what he's after. Because the king seems to have depleted at this juncture, some evidence the king has depleted his much of the wealth that he has. But verse 2, that all the king's servants within the gate bowed and paid homage to him, and as the king had commanded. Now we learn a couple of things here before we go any further about Mordecai not doing that. Is that honored men are not always worthy. That's a very practical thing to learn. Just because someone is revered and held in high esteem or makes it to a high office does not mean they're worthy men. And so don't forget about political office, forget about kings or presidents or senators and governors, etc. Sometimes it may be in business, it may be even in the church. Sometimes because somebody is revered and honored, that doesn't mean they're worthy at all. Haman certainly wasn't. But anyway, we have Haman is promoted. Now we don't know what all's going on of them bowing before the king until we get a little bit later to verses 3 and 4. And so we're going to save our comments there. Make sense? He's been promoted and people are bowing before him and honoring him. All right, let's go to verse 2b through 4. Mordecai wouldn't do that. Why wouldn't he do that? Okay. There is some bad blood here. That's true. To bow before the king, was it wrong to bow before the king? No. David accepted that. Let me give you some references on that. 2 Samuel 14:4. Pfeiffer mentions this. Willis mentions these same passages. Several mention these passages. 2 Samuel 14:4, David received the bowing down before him, but it wasn't as worship, but bowing before in respect for the king. We see the same thing in chapter 18 in verse 28. The same thing in 1 Kings chapter 1 in verse 16 of bowing before the king in the sense that you show respect and reverence and submission to the king. But there's a difference in that as we have, for example, let's fast forward to the book of Revelation when they bow before the emperor and say Caesar is Lord. That was a religious thing. And this seems to be what's going on here with reference to treating him as if he were a god. And here's why I think that be the case. Let's look at verse 3. He said he would not bow nor pay homage. And yet, all through the Bible, for example, before they went into captivity, there was the statement of giving submission to the king. Remember that in some of the prophets. Don't fight and resist the king. Just go and submit to the king, to Nebuchadnezzar or whoever. Remember those passages. Jeremiah talks about that. Isaiah talks about that principle. Be that as it may, look at verse 4. That it happened when they spoke daily to him that he would not listen to them. And they told it to Haman to see whether Haman's words would stand. What does that mean? They go to Haman and tell, here's what this Mordecai is doing. We won't see if it'll stand. What does that mean? If he's going to tolerate, yeah, that's what that means. Are you going to tolerate that? And for Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. I don't think it's just that I'm a Jew, my nationality is a Jew, as much as I'm a Jew and I have, it has to do with my religion. Does that make sense? And I think that's part of it. Let's get ahead of ourselves to verse 8. They have a law. These Jews have a law that's different from our laws. Does that make sense? So there is bad blood between those who had attacked them before. That's true. I think it's more of this bowing before and doing some kind of homage in the sense of treating him as a god, treating him more than just a leader. And Mordecai's refusing to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not doing that because I'm a Jew. All right, and I learned 2 lessons so far before we get to verse 5. I'm learning from that there is a time to violate the law. Would you agree? Rule-based civil law, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, etc., etc. But is there a time to disobey the law? Defiantly disobey it. When?
When it conflicts with God's word, human law is to be exceeded when it conflicts with God's law.
Absolutely. Acts 5 and verse 29 would be a text. And so here is I'm seeing Mordecai as a man of strong faith. His faith comes out in chapter 4. That it has to do with my religion, and I am not, no matter what the consequences are, and the consequences are going to end up being the destruction of the Jews if something's not done about that. But he's willing to stand. Notice that when Mordecai finds out about all of this, he never caves and goes back and says, I'll tell you what I'll do homage before I'll encourage all my people to do homage. He's not going to do it, no matter what the threat is. He's not going to do that at all. Yes. Has to do with my religion will not allow that. All right, let's go to 5 and 6. Haman is angered to the point he's ready to kill all the Jews. So what's happened in 5 and 6? Someone quickly, just give me a summary. Why didn't he just kill Mordecai? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's not just Mordecai won't do that. He's a Jew. We've got a bunch of them around here. We got a bunch of them here in Persia. And he lets it be known, or they let it be known. And so Mordecai, notice that he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. I mean, Haman had to disdain to do that. He told that the people of Mordecai. Instead, then he was ready then to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom. All right, I'm going to say more about that in a moment. It's going to get to 7 to 15. Haman persuades the king to destroy all the Jews. Look at verse 7. That in the first month, which was the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast that is, lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. All right. Let's make a couple of notes here. They cast which means they cast lots. Let's make a note and a connection with chapter 9 and in verse 26. Later, when they make a celebration about the salvation of the Jews, they called the days Purim, named after Pur, and therefore it became all the words of this letter, etc. So they had a festival named after this casting of lots. Now, there's another passage we need to tie with that, and that's Proverbs 16:23. Someone read that for me. Proverbs 16 and 33. What does that mean? All right. Casting a lot. How was that done? Well, it was done different ways. Sometimes it may be like we think of drawing straws. Some scholars have talked about the rolling of the knuckle bone of an animal, like we think of rolling a dice. So for lack of better illustration, they wouldn't have used dice, but something similar where let's see what day it falls upon. Do we want to do it what month? And so they basically a game of chance. But Proverbs 16 is saying that quite often when that was done, God made the decision. Make sense? God made that decision, and it seems to be God made that decision here. Because now we've already noted, in fact, let's add another note to that if I can find my remote. Let's add another passage, chapter 3 and verse 7. Here's another providential passage of the year delay. There's a year delay. Now, I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to leave this, but I'm coming right back to this slide here in just a second. Let's take a look at the calendar. The calendar, Nisan, is right here. This is the month Nisan, and they cast lots for what month it would be, so they go all the way around 11 months later to Adar. See that? So it's 11 months, almost a year. So basically there's a year span before they're going to execute the plan. Now that seems to me to be an act of providence. So that year delay is seemingly an act of providence. So it was basically April of the following year. Of that later that year, April for us, and so their year didn't start in January. Make sense? So that's later on in the late in the year for them. All right, makes sense. They cast lots. Now that seems to be an act of providence to me. That the queen's been taken off. The queen comes. Esther comes in. The casting of lots. And determining that that's going to be a year later. What happens in 8 through 11? All right, he convinces, we're going to execute this plan. But I want you to notice what happens in verse 8. There's a couple of things that we're learning. Verse 8, by the way, is one of the first references to the dispersion of the Jews, meaning this is one of the first references to the Jews that chose to stay when they returned. Now Ezra hadn't returned yet, but there seems to be some that were dispersed who chose to stay in spite of the first and then the second and the third return. Make sense? And this seems to be one of the first references to that dispersed among the people. But I want you to notice the charge that he made. He said concerning these people, their laws are different from all other peoples. Is that true? Yeah, that's true. Now, here's a practical thing. When you're given a temptation or a challenge in the midst of a crooked world, are they going to recognize you go by a law different from everybody else's law? Or are they going to think, they live just like the rest of us? Or are they going to make the statement, something's got to be done about these people because they live by a different law than the rest of us live by. Sometimes we live by the same law of the world. But Mordecai was living by a different law. That's a practical thing to learn. But anyway, he goes on further, and they do not keep the king's law. Was that true? Not on that point. But that's not what he said. He said they don't keep the king's law. He's trying to poison the well against the Jews. Did the Jews keep the king's law? Yes. That was a lie. But what he does, he takes partial truth and builds a case against people. Because he could prove they have a different law. He could prove that Mordecai had violated one of those laws. And there he builds a case in order to destroy all the Jews. All right, for what that may be worth. Now, so he said, if it pleases the king, verse 9, let a decree be written, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver. Now, there's a big discussion among commentators. Where'd that money come from? It may have come from Haman, as Stephen mentioned a moment ago. It may have been his wealth that the king wants. And so I want that man that can give me that kind of wealth into the kingdom. I want to think that Haman, the ruthless guy that he is, and I believe it's Colin Date that you suggest that they thought perhaps that he's going to take it from the plunder of the Jews. We're going to kill the Jews and we're going to plunder them. I know he plans to plunder them, verse 13, and we're going to take everything they have, and we'll get from that all of this wealth, and it'll be put into the king's treasury. I think that's where it came from, but can I prove that? No. But he doesn't seem like a generous fellow to me, for what it may be worth. Now, well, how much is that? 10,000 talents of silver. I don't know. Pfeiffer said, and this was in 1962, so that's a few years back. That's 60, what is that, Larry? 60 years. That's 60 years. Yeah, 60 years. 60 years ago. He said 15 million. Wiersbe is a little later than that. Wiersbe says it comes to the day in which he wrote his material was 25 million. That's a lot of money. So this is not just like, there's, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000. It's millions in our day and time, perhaps greater than 25 million. So anyway, be that as it may, we're going to put that into the king's coffers. Now, at verse 11, before we leave that section, the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as it seems good. What does that mean? I don't know. Some suggest, and I'll just throw this out for what it's worth, accept it or reject it, that the king basically says, I'm not interested in all the money, just execute your plan and use the money however it needs to be used to execute your plan. I don't know. I'll leave for you to decide. I hadn't figured that one out. All right, 12 to 15 now. Let's get to finish the rest of the chapter and move on to chapter 4. The decree was written throughout the land. And so let's hit the high points and then let's move to chapter 4. So the king issued the decree, and let's drop down to verse 13. They sent letters by couriers throughout the king's provinces, and notice what the instructions are. They are to, verse 13, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews. And when by all the Jews, that's not all the men, that's women and little children and men, all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the month of Adar, etc., on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And notice then what else he mentions, and to plunder their possessions. That makes me think that's where he's getting his money. I don't know, but it sure is suspicious to me. It's kind of like a thief breaks in and says, if you'll give me permission to break into that guy's house over there, I'll give you, a bunch of guns. Well, we're breaking in, the guy's got a bunch of guns over there. That's where it's coming from, most likely. But anyway, now let's get verse 14. Verse 14 said, a copy of the document was issued and published for all people that they should be ready for that day. That's an interesting phrase to me. What do you make of that? That they should be ready, that all people should be ready for that day. It's going to be a bad day. All right? I think there's two things involved. One, this decree goes to everybody, and Haman indicates that the rest of the Jews, Esther hadn't seen this yet, but the other Jews have gotten this message. So he goes out to the Jews and goes out to the non-Jews, to all the Persians. That the Persians are to be there to help execute all these Jews need to be killed, whatever needs to be done, they need to kill them, annihilate them, and plunder their goods. So be ready to help on that day. Jews be ready to be killed. Does that make sense? I take it that it's a direction to both of them. Now, you may take it only to apply to the Persians. I take it's a document that was sent out. Everybody needs to be ready. You need to be ready to get killed, and you need to be ready to help plunder when they're killing. Now, you think what that does to the Jews. Think about what that does to the Jews. All right, now verse 15, the couriers went out, and then, so the king, notice, the king and Haman sat down to drink. In other words, they just gave a command, we're going to kill a bunch of people. Now let's celebrate. Let's have a drink. And careless, carefree. But here's something else. The city of Shushan was perplexed. English Standard, say the same thing. I'm sorry? Thrown into confusion. That's what I was looking for. Thrown into confusion. What do you make of that?
They didn't know why. It didn't make any sense all of a sudden. How does it, there was nothing that they knew about that would have caused.
What in the world's going on? Yeah. Wow. What's this about? The Jews have been here for a long time, and then all of a sudden we're going to kill them all. I take it that many of the Persians didn't necessarily approve of that. But they got to live in fear of the king. But they don't approve of what's going on. They're kind of, say it again, give me the English Standard again.
But the city of Susa was
Thrown into confusion. And I get this picture like, what? What is this? All right. Any questions or comments on chapter 3? All right, question number 6. How did Esther learn about this plot? Mordecai lets her know. All right, chapter 4. Esther is informed of the plot and agrees to help. So verses 1 to 3, Mordecai is mourning. So let's quickly take a look because I want to get down to about verse 14 and let's make some practical stuff there. Verses 1 to 3, Mordecai, when he learned it, put on sackcloth and ashes, and he cries bitterly. And what does Esther do? Verse 4. Before you comment on that, verse 3, here's where I mentioned a moment ago. The Jews all seem to have got this message, and what are they doing? I mean, out in all the provinces, yeah, they're wailing about this too, and Mordecai is all upset. And so the queen, Esther, verse 4, so let's look at 4 to 9, she sought to comfort Mordecai. She sent garments seemingly to have him to come. He can't come to the king's court and see her with the sackcloth on, and so here's a change of garments, but he wouldn't accept them. What does that tell you? Yeah, I'm not coming out of mourning. There's a reason to mourn. She doesn't know all of that yet. So now let's get to, she sent Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, and to go see what's going on. And so Hathach went to Mordecai, and Mordecai told her all that had happened and the sum of money that he had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. And then he issues, here's his proof. Here's the decree, verse 8. And so Hathach returned and told all the words to Esther. So that's how she found out, this messenger. And that was quick to go through that. But now, I want you to notice at verse, where am I? Verse 9, or verse 10. Beginning at verse 10, Esther's going to agree to help. So let's get, beginning at verse 10 now. At first, she's going to refuse. Esther spoke to Hathach and gave the command to Mordecai. All the king's servants and provinces know that any man or anyone that goes to the inner court of the king and has not been called, he has but one law, to all death, except to the one he holds out this golden scepter that he may live. And before we go any further, what is that telling you? What does that tell you about the king, first of all? He's not approachable. He's a ruthless king. And she says, he's got this rule, and if you even come in and ask to see him and you haven't been invited, he'll kill you. That's the way it is. I mean, that's pretty severe. Talking about having a gatekeeper. Man, that was a gatekeeper and a half. You're going to be killed. You can't see the president until you're just going to get killed. That's all there is. And she said she added something else. And in my case, being the queen, Same rule applied, and in fact, I have not even been in 30 days. In a month, I hadn't been invited before the king. And what am I going to do? All All right, that gets us down through verse 11. So they told the words to Mordecai. Now, we get into some interesting things. At verse 13, Mordecai told them to give this answer to Esther. Do you think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews? What's his point? Yeah, you're a Jew. You're going to get killed too. Absolutely. Very good, yes. You're a Jew, you're going to get killed too. This is for all the Jews. That includes you. You're included. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Well, let's stop there. There's 2 or 3 things we want to point out. If you remain silent at this time, there's a practical thing. When there is a crisis and you remain silent, finish my sentence. I'm not looking for one thing. That's just, I'm giving you a starter. Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember the phrase, but I see the point that, yeah, you remain silent while you see evil going on, then you're contributing to the problem. And so Esther, you can't stay silent here. But I want you to notice this statement right here at verse 14. We're going to camp right here at verse 14 for a few moments. That he said, if you remain silent this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews for another place. Read that again. What does that tell you? If you don't say anything, or if you stay silent, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Bingo. Absolutely. He has faith that God's going to spare the Jews. I just believe God will. Does he have a promise? Well, he might be thinking of some things about the Jewish nation. I don't know. He may be thinking of promises to Abraham. He may be thinking of that. He may be thinking of what prophets have said about the Messiah. I don't know. I don't know what he's thinking. Except he seems to be showing faith that God's going to spare. If you're not the tool that's going to be used to spare the Jews, deliverance is going to come from somewhere, but you may end up dying in the process. So notice his courage and his faith that God is going to provide. I just believe God's going to provide deliverance. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know how it's going to come, but I think God's going to do it. Now here's a statement we've focused on many times. But you and your father's house will perish. Here's the phrase. Yet who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? What's he saying? Absolutely. God, now, does Mordecai know God placed her on the throne? No. He don't know that. But he's saying it very well may be. That's the terminology we need to use. Who knows? Who knows? And so let me footnote here. Before I'm ready to say, I know God put you here to accomplish this. I don't know that God did that. Who knows but what he did, though. Make sense? It's possible. That's what Mordecai is saying. It very well may be, Esther, that God put you on this throne so you would be in a position to go before the king. That may be what this is all about. It may very may be. All right, Providence Passages. You might mark 4:14. He's saying, Esther, you may have come to the throne. And I put question mark because that's what Mordecai is raising the question. Now, I think we've got a bird's eye view, seeing the whole picture, that, yeah, that's why she's on the throne. But Mordecai don't know that. But he's kind of wondering about that. It very well may be that I think deliverance is going to come from somewhere, but it may be that God was planning on bringing it through you. Okay? All right. Now then, beginning at verse 15, the chart you're seeing we're going to come back to. Let's go now to verse 15. Esther agrees to approach the king. So she told Mordecai, Esther told them to take this answer back to Mordecai. Now here's verse 16, I'm sorry. Go and gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast for me neither eat nor drink for 3 days and nights, and may the maid and my maids and I will likewise fast. And then she said she'll go to the king. Let's talk about going to the king in a moment. You might mark verse 16, prayer is implied. Prayer is never mentioned by name. Prayer and providence go hand in hand. They are so laced together you can't pull them apart. Does that make sense? You're not going to pull prayer and providence apart. Try and you're going to rip and tear something. They don't come apart. They go hand in hand. All right, with that in mind, these are symbols for prayer, Joel 1:14. I'm not going to take time to go there. But these are symbols for prayer, and thus prayer seems to be implied. In other words, we're going to fast, we're going to pray. So, okay, I got you, Mordecai. We're going to pray our hearts out. And you tell everybody to pray and fast and pray, and we're going to pray and we're going to pray and we're going to pray. And though prayer's never mentioned, it's implied to me. So, you might put 4:16 down as one of those Providence passages. All right? And then she says, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Courage. You're talking about courage. That took courage. She's already said she was scared of being killed by the king. She's the queen, but she could be killed by the king. But she said, I'm willing to go do this, and I'm going to approach him, and I'm going to go before the king. Let's pray about it, and let's pray about it, let's pray about it, and I'm going to go before the king, and if I lose my life, I lose my life. That's just the way it is. She stood up. Now, so here's a statement of faith in verse 16 and a statement of courage, verse 16. Make sense? Let me add a footnote. Here's something she didn't do, nor did Mordecai do this. Quite often, let me tell you what the misconception I'm going to answer, and then we're going to go to the text. Quite often you hear people say, I don't know that we need to act or do anything in some circumstance because God's going to do what he's going to do, and we can't have any impact. And this is not a political statement, but several brethren have argued we ought not vote because God's going to raise up leaders that he wants, and so we're not going to be able to have any impact. So we're not going to do. There's no need. Christians just really shouldn't vote because God's going to do what he wants to, and we can't offset God anyway. Mordecai said, God's going to do something, but I'm not so sure but what it may be through you, so why don't you go and act? He didn't say, I can't do anything, you can't do anything. God's going to do what he's going to do anyway. Nor did Esther say, God's got it wound up and going to do what he's going to do, and no need me going before the king, because if he's going to save us, he's going to save us. If he's not, he's not. She thought she needed to act, and she did. Make sense? Up and down, yes. All right. Questions, comments? Do what? She was a good queen. So, to me, the statements of providence make lots of sense. Now, I'm going to leave it at that because our time is gone. Questions, comments, practical things you've learned? Exactly. All right, chapters 5 and 6 next time. We'll see how this is all carried out.